Up until recently, I thought I had a really good understanding of covert narcissism. And if you've seen my previous videos, you'll know that I describe my ex as someone who suffered from both BPD and NPD, in particular covert narcissism. And while I could always talk about what covert narcissism was, and I understood where it came from, kind of how it manifested in general, and you know, how the source of emotional pain was there for my ex, if I'm honest with myself, I could never really diagram and get to the really root cause of it. And I think a lot of that was because I was blocked emotionally myself. And it's not until last weekend, in an unusual series of events, that I feel like I fully understand it. And to the point where I can describe it in very simple terms, both to my ex and to anyone else. So I thought I'd make a video about that, about how that came about, and hope it might shed a bit of insight, because I've always found covert narcissism a slightly nebulous kind of term. It's very hard to pinpoint. So if you compare it to someone who's a grandiose narcissist, it's obvious to relate why we would call them narcissists. You know, that they're very ostentatious, they're very kind of braggy, they like to do things they like to be the best, they like to be better than other people. It's very apparent. But like I said, if I'm honest about how I feel about covert narcissism, I guess I always felt like I had trouble relating how you could really call it narcissism when someone's kind of vulnerable. I get the manipulation, I get all the behavior behind it, but I could never really tangibly relate it back to why we would call that narcissism until last weekend. And the key thing that happened last weekend is I actually spent just over 48 hours with my ex. And that the background to that and some other learnings, it was an insightful 48 hours for me. I learned a huge amount. It was something I was quite apprehensive about. I wasn't sure whether it was a very smart idea, but actually coming out of it, I learned a huge amount. It clarified a huge amount for me, and I feel a lot better for it. And I'm not recommending for a second that everyone goes out and meets their ex and spends some time with them. You know, that's probably a very bad idea, but in the sense of how it landed for me, it worked out very well. And like I said, I'll make a video separately about kind of what else I learned in that. But what it gave me was a really key insight into, I guess, why I would describe her behavior as narcissism, and why she does what she does, and I guess ultimately where our relationship went, and hopefully give a bit of insight into what covert narcissists do, or at least in my case, what my ex did and the reason that she did it and what she gets out of that. And also, although this might be a bit of a long video, I'll try and describe why, you know, the light bulb moment I had as to why that's really a problem, why my relationship broke down, and also kind of why ultimately what they're doing can't work. So to give a tiny bit of background as to how it came around, my ex had needed to come back for a while, for quite some time, to pick up some stuff that she had left in the house, you know, some fairly big items. She also wanted to come back and see some of the animals. You know, we've got a cat who's fairly old, must be about 19 years old now. We're not sure how long she'll live for. So I agreed to say, look, you know, I've got spare rooms. If you want to come back, you know, you can stay overnight. It's about, you know, it's a good 3-hour drive for her to come back. So I said, look, if you want to stay overnight, if anything goes in any way, you know, wrong, then just please leave the house. You know, it's my house now. It's my home. I pay for it. Please leave and go back home, and let's not fight about anything. So I was a little bit apprehensive going into it, but not for any reasons of other than that I thought we might argue about stuff. You know, but generally I was quite calm. You know, I'm not hung up about, I wasn't actually worried about seeing her as a person and how I would feel. It was more about, you know, will old anger come up and will we end up getting into fights that could turn nasty? But it felt quite calm. I hadn't seen her for about 6 months. And what was really interesting about it was actually a very, very calm 48 hours, which was nice to see. And again, makes me think that, you know, I believe that they can achieve stability, albeit that they need to take it from other people, which is ultimately where it goes wrong. You know, I don't think they're able to achieve stability by their own means a lot of the time. But there are a couple of key insights as to kind of where I realized that covert narcissism and what they need from other people actually relates to narcissism, you know, in the feeling, the needing to feel really important. One of the first things that I realized, and this was a really, really insightful thing for me, is, I think she ended up staying for 2 nights in one of the spare rooms, and in both evenings she had talked to her new boyfriend on the phone, and this is the boyfriend that had kind of ended our relationship. And I don't know if that talking on the phone was deliberate. I suspect it may have been a little bit in an attempt to do some kind of manipulation, but it was fairly loud, and I could overhear it without even trying to overhear it, even with my TV on slightly. And what I noticed is that a lot of her conversation with her new boyfriend is a direct repeat of what we went through when we were young, and we're talking early 20s. And that is knowing that he's quite a shy, not outgoing person. A lot of the conversation was about trying to model and push his career. So he's someone that's coming straight out of finishing a PhD at uni, not really spent time in the private sector. And she's the opposite. She spent a lot of time in the private sector. And a lot of the conversation was about trying to steer him towards certain careers in a positive way, trying to, land him good jobs. He's a qualified person. He's an intelligent person, but maybe doesn't have the social skills to go and, really follow through on interviews and land a tough interview. And a lot of the conversation was just around that, was around helping his career, was about modeling it, was around trying to push him in the right direction. And to her credit, she did that with me. When I met my ex, I was a working class boy, had no real aspirations to go anywhere. I thought I'd work in something like a factory for the rest of my life, just kind of like my parents did. And actually she instilled a lot of that drive in me and pushed my career and advanced my career. And I have to give credit to that. While I think it's very easy for us to jump into these things and look back and think that everything's negative, I without a doubt can admit that my ex played a very positive role in my life in a number of ways. I don't look back and think it's all bad, but it's interesting seeing that behavior repeated, that, trying to steer the career. And that was an insightful thing. In a way, it was quite a sweet thing to hear. I wasn't carrying any anger about it. I wasn't feeling any jealousy. I'm very settled in my new life. In a way, it was actually quite sweet, but I'll come back to that in a second. And the other instances that made me realise that was similar behaviour was that she's kept in contact with 2 friends from the city near where I live and where she used to work. And interestingly, both of those friends that she's kept in contact with and went to see while she was here have both got significant, I'd say, psychological issues, bad decision making, bad choice of partners, leaving multiple partners, some chemical addiction, people that are decent people, but are having issues in their life that are very apparent, that they've disclosed to her. And she's become very close friends with. And a lot of the conversation I had with her was about, how she really wants to help these people, how she wants to help one of them get off of kind of medication, how she wants to help one of them find another job. And it was just really interesting to see that pattern. There's a common theme there, that all of the people that she's choosing to keep in her life all have some kind of dependency on her, some kind of need, or she can feed into their lives in a positive way. She wants to help them out. She wants to help improve their lives. And that's a really, really interesting observation. And it wasn't until I think I've exited that relationship and I'm able to look at it completely dispassionately, almost as a stranger now, almost as just an independent, non-emotionally engaged third party, that I'm able to spot the patterns. And it really got me thinking, because part of me was thinking, actually, she's quite a good friend. She wants to help these people out. She's trying to steer her new boyfriend's career. She's trying to help him develop his life. And I thought, I had to challenge myself and think, what's wrong with that? Actually, that's quite positive. That's quite, a nice thing. And that got me thinking to the next kind of level of, it is a nice thing, but she's also getting something out of that. It's a where this turns particularly bad and can go wrong is at this stage. It's all very helpful. She's helping her boyfriend out. She's helping friends out. But what's wrong with this situation is there's an implicit transaction within those relationships that's unspoken, it's unsaid, and it's unagreed. No one's agreed to this explicitly, which is part of the problem. And that is that that my ex wants to be someone in these people's lives that is remembered, that has made a significant difference to their lives. And she ultimately wants to be one of the most important people. She wants them to remember her or to think of her as one of the most important people in their lives, as someone who's made a massive difference. And it's more than a need to be needed. I always think about it as, do narcissists just have a need to be needed? But it's more than that. It's that need to be needed and a need to be admired, a need to be omnipotent, a need for someone, for anyone, whoever it is, multiple people, to think of them as the best thing ever, as someone who made the most difference to their life ever. And that's really where the narcissism comes in. It's not a healthy transaction. It's not a healthy need. It's a desire to have that kind of ultimate admiration from someone, that they'll look back and say that person made such a difference to my life, or they are making such a difference to my life, that is the ultimate need that she has. And that's, when I think about it, that's how I can relate it back and actually call it narcissistic. And this got me thinking back to the one time that I think I maybe made a slight dent in my ex-wife's thinking, when I actually challenged her with a question that maybe made her question her own perspective on things. And that was a few years ago, as we were going through some of our troubles and she was at university. She had a young colleague there, a young man who came from a fairly conservative background, who was extremely shy. And while that would normally fit her profile for someone that she could maybe target for a new supply, his background really didn't suit her. So he was from a very conservative Muslim family, and she's an ethnic minority herself, and she tends to target she tends to be attracted to white people, not other ethnic minorities in terms of physical attraction. But the only other reason I mentioned he was from a conservative Muslim family is I do believe, especially if you're a visible Muslim in the UK, it can put up some boundaries in the job market. I do believe there's some slight prejudice to sort of traditionally dressed Muslim people within certain industries, particularly in sort of the financial sector in London. And with him being very shy and from that kind of background, he was really struggling to find any kind of meaningful work, considering how good he was at mathematics. He was working very menial jobs that were way below him. And she seemed really focused, almost obsessed with this, to the point where I actually tried to help him find a job through my company. I put him in touch with a few people to see if we could use his mathematics skills. And she was trying to arrange interviews through agents. And at one point, we were talking about it, and I stopped her, and she said she really wants to make a difference to this young man's life. And I stopped her and I challenged her on it. And the question that I asked her that I think even her therapist thought was a good question and mentioned that it was a good question was, would she be doing this? Would she take all this action? Would she go to this effort if he never found out it was her that did it? And she admitted there that no, she wouldn't. A big part of why she was doing this was that he would then know that it was her that had arranged it for it. And that for me leads into a big part of a narcissistic test, particularly a covert narcissistic test, is, if it's not altruistic, it goes into that, implicit, unsaid transaction. And the problem with that is, for example, if I wanted to help someone out and I wanted to find someone a job, I would feel good about finding them a job. And this is where empathy can come in a little bit. So the reason that would drive me to try and help someone improve their career, which I've done many times in my career, I've tried to help people that I think really deserve a chance, is that the injustice, the feeling of injustice of someone that I think deserves a chance not getting a chance is effectively a pain for me. So the reason I want to do it, although this sounds selfish, is to alleviate that pain from me. It's not to get a reward from that person. It's almost that it's nagging me, and I want to alleviate that pain. It's my conscience, it's my empathy there, maybe sympathy. When it came to her wanting to do it for this young man or other people, it's for the recognition. She wants that person to think of her as the person who saved their life, effectively. And again, I look at what's the problem with that. Ultimately, is it landing in a good way? But the problem is, because that transaction between the person giving the admiration and the person extracting that admiration from the supply, because it's unsaid, it's unspoken, it goes on and neither party has signed up to that agreement, in any way. And what happened I think with my own relationship is that transaction was going on. I was feeding the supply, I was providing the supply and she had the need, but neither of us really knew it. And as that dynamic changed, as she finished working, as I became the sole breadwinner, as I was starting to make more decisions, as I didn't need her anymore, in her mind financially, in my mind I needed her emotionally, in a relationship, but in all the measures that she saw it, I didn't need her anymore, and that caused her a lot of distress. That caused her to seek that new supply, but that transaction was never explicit. Even though it was operating for almost 2 decades, it was never said and it was never really understood, and that ultimately is the big problem with that kind of non-altruistic relationship, is that someone's giving something and someone's taking something, but neither of them really know that they're doing it. And ultimately, if that dynamic changes in the future, then the relationship will collapse. And as we know with narcissistic personality disorder, the collapse of that relationship, the stress of that collapse, is likely to cause a huge amount of trauma, a huge amount of pain, a huge amount of emotion that's no good for either party. And that is why I think the cycle keeps repeating. So it was a really interesting insight for me to see, almost as a neutral observer, my ex's behavior and why she does what she does, and why ultimately I would call it narcissism. It's that core need to feel like she has made the biggest difference to someone's life, whether it's a lot of people or a few people. I think in her case it's just a few people, but she needs to feel, whether it's through kind of sexual love bombing, or whether it's through financial support, or whether it's through kind of career support, she ultimately needs to feel like she's made the biggest impression on someone's life, that she has become one of the most influential people in their lives. And that's ultimately where the narcissism comes from. And I realise why it's doomed to fail, because if that dynamic, that implicit, that unsaid, that non-altruistic transaction changes, if the new supplier, whether it's the sexual supply, the romantic supply, the friend supply, the support supply, if that changes, that dynamic changes, then ultimately that transaction's broken, which is extremely stressful for the narcissist, which will seek them to, make them seek to replace it, which for everyone involved is a very traumatic experience. If I look at the long-term prospects of the romantic new supply in my ex's life, the signs aren't good. He's a good 10 years younger, coming into the prime of his life in terms of age and career and probably earning potential. As she exits that prime, there's a real risk there that although it's working for her now, that dynamic is going to change very soon. And that's a very sad thing for me to think about. And that's where I need to block off my own emotions. But, in the short term, at least for me, it's actually really useful. It's actually quite nice for me to think, the part of me that kept me codependent, the need to worry about someone, the need to feel like I need to help someone and fix someone. Actually, by having her quite stable in another relationship, it allows me to just walk away and say, actually, look, this is settled now. She's in quite a calm place. Her needs are being met, albeit I would say on a temporary basis, and albeit I would say that it's going to come at the cost of pain for everyone involved again. But there's not much I can do. It's for her and other parties involved to look at now, and I've done my piece, and it's allowed me to walk on and get on with my own life. And I don't know if that's helpful to anyone there, but if you're watching this and like me, you struggled with trying to associate kind of the nebulous term of covert narcissism with actual narcissism, like why is it narcissistic, then just try and realize that it's that extraction of need, it's that being admired, it's the being the most important person to someone, to anyone, in whatever means is possible, whatever means they've learned to use. That is where the true narcissism in covert narcissism comes from, in my opinion. And the really sad thing when I think about it, looking back, it is, I think that's a feeling that is instilled in most of us, in most fairly well-balanced people. That's a feeling that's instilled very early on in life by I think parental love, particularly maternal love. I think kind of unwavering love from a maternal figure, instills that feeling of being important to most people. And when I look back at what I know her background is, it's quite a sad thought to think I don't think that was ever there. And what it represents now is someone continuously seeking that feeling because they lack that feeling from an early age. They don't have it, it's not an innate feeling they carry around with them anymore. And they're looking to soothe it, constantly through other people. And ultimately, I think that's what narcissistic personality comes down to.